Each night brought new marks, but no explanation. The best specialists failed. Cameras captured only shadows on the sheets. Something invisible was feeding on her while she slept. When the truth came to light, it was already too late. The alarm sounded punctually at 6 in the morning in the luxurious apartment on Park Avenue, New York City. Elizabeth Morgan, one of the most promising executives in the American financial market, reached out to silence it and felt that uncomfortable itching again. Turning on the bedside lamp, she noticed red spots spread across her forearm, the third occurrence that week. "Damn, not again," she muttered as she got up from her king-size bed and walked to the marble-lined bathroom mirror. She examined the reddish marks that now also spread across her neck and upper back. The itching was unbearable. Elizabeth, at 38, had achieved everything she had always dreamed of. She was the financial director of one of the largest investment banks in the country, owned a stunning apartment overlooking Central Park, and had just finished decorating after months of renovation and importing exclusive furniture from Indonesia and Thailand. Her professional life was at its peak, with rumors that she would be promoted to president of the institution in the coming months, becoming the first woman to hold the position. However, 2 weeks ago, those mysterious marks began to appear. Initially, she believed it to be a simple allergic reaction to new cleaning products or the fabrics of her newly purchased bedding. She changed everything, but the marks persisted. It must be some kind of bed bug, she concluded, after searching the internet. That same morning, she called Mrs. Zimmerman, the housekeeper, who had been taking care of the apartment for more than 5 years. "Mrs. Zimmerman, hire the best extermination service in the city today. I don't care about the price. I want them to do a complete cleaning, especially in the bedroom." The housekeeper, who had always kept the apartment impeccable, seemed offended. "But, Ms. Morgan, I check the mattresses every week when I change. The bedding. I've never seen any bugs. Are you sure it's not an allergy?" "I'm sure something is biting me during the night. It can only be some kind of insect. Just do what I'm asking, please." That afternoon, while Elizabeth was conducting a crucial meeting with foreign investors, she felt the itching intensify. She struggled to maintain her composure, but one of the investors, Thomas Jensen from Denmark, noticed her discomfort. "Is everything all right, Ms. Morgan?" he asked. "Perfectly," she responded firmly, discreetly adjusting her blazer sleeve to hide the marks. "Let's continue with the third quarter numbers." After the meeting, her assistant, Richard Cooper, entered the room carrying documents that needed signatures. "Beth, I don't want to be intrusive, but are you okay? You seem a bit distracted lately." Richard was one of the few people in the corporate environment with whom Elizabeth maintained a relationship of trust. They had started at the bank together 12 years ago, and although she had ascended more quickly in her career, they maintained a genuine friendship. "Actually, I'm not okay," she admitted, showing the marks on her arm. "Something is attacking me during sleep. I've already changed the mattress, sheets, hired extermination. Nothing works." Richard examined the marks with curiosity. "My cousin went through something similar last year. It was a rare type of mite. Have you seen a specialist?" "Not yet, but I will. I just want to resolve this before the board meeting next week. I can't show up like this in front of the shareholders." Upon returning to her apartment that night, Elizabeth found the place with a strong smell of insecticide. Mrs. Zimmerman informed her that the extermination service had been carried out as instructed. "They said they didn't find anything, Ms. Morgan. No bedbugs, no fleas, nothing. They did a preventive application anyway." Elizabeth thanked her, and after the housekeeper left, prepared for another night of discomfort. In an attempt to identify what was happening, she positioned her tablet on the nightstand, setting it to record all night. She took an antihistamine and fell asleep, hoping that the next morning the mystery would be solved. She woke up at 3 in the morning with a violent itching. New marks had appeared on her abdomen and thighs. Frustrated, she checked the recording, but nothing abnormal appeared. Just herself moving during sleep. Whatever was causing it was invisible to cameras. In the weeks that followed, the situation only worsened. Elizabeth replaced the mattress with a brand new one, imported from Sweden. She replaced all the bedding with hypoallergenic ones. She hired 3 more extermination companies, each specializing in a different type of urban pest. Nothing worked. The problem began to affect her professional performance. During video conferences, Elizabeth found herself instinctively scratching her arms. In face-to-face meetings, she wore long-sleeved clothes, even on the hottest days, to hide the marks that now spread across almost her entire body. Monday, a particularly difficult afternoon, after cancelling a presentation to investors due to intense discomfort, Richard suggested a radical solution. "Why don't you spend a few nights at my beach house in Martha's Vineyard? If the marks disappear, we'll be sure it's something in your apartment." The proposal made sense. Elizabeth managed to reorganize her schedule, and the following Friday, she left for the coast of Massachusetts. Richard's house was simple, quite different from her sophisticated apartment, but cozy. Surprisingly, after 2 nights there, the marks began to disappear and no new ones appeared. "It has to be something in my apartment," she concluded, feeling relieved for the first time in weeks. Upon returning to New York on Monday, Elizabeth was determined to discover the source of the problem. She called Julia Vasquez, her dermatologist, and managed to get an emergency appointment for that afternoon. The doctor carefully examined the remaining marks. "These are clearly bites of some kind, Elizabeth. It's not an allergic reaction or a dermatological condition. Something is really biting you during the night. But I've tried everything. 3 different extermination companies said there is no infestation. What else could it be?" Julia hesitated before answering. "Maybe it's time to seek more specialized help. I know an entomologist from Columbia University, Professor Oliver Quinn. He's an expert in tropical insects and invasive species. I can ask him to examine your apartment." Elizabeth agreed immediately. Any possibility of resolution seemed valid at that point. The next day, Professor Quinn, a thin man in his 60s, with thick-framed glasses and a hunched posture typical of someone who spends hours at the microscope, appeared at her apartment. "Interesting, very interesting," he murmured, as he examined Elizabeth's bedroom with a special light magnifying glass. "You imported furniture recently, correct?" "Yes, practically all the furniture. Why?" The professor didn't answer immediately. He continued his meticulous inspection around the corners of the room, paying special attention to the bed and nearby furniture. Finally, after almost 2 hours of searching, he turned to Elizabeth with a grave expression. "Ms. Morgan, I believe I've found something quite unusual. I'll need to collect samples and analyze them in the laboratory. But I have an initial suspicion that would explain your symptoms." "What would that be?" she asked, anxious for any answer. "I prefer to confirm before unnecessarily alarming you. I'll return tomorrow with more precise information." When the professor left, Elizabeth felt a chill. For the first time since the problem began, she had the feeling that something really serious was happening, something that perhaps went beyond simple bed bugs or common mites. The night that followed was one of almost total insomnia, not only because of the itching, but because of the anxiety to discover what might be causing that torment. As the evening of the following day approached, Professor Oliver Quinn returned to Elizabeth's apartment carrying a metal briefcase and an even more serious expression than before. She was at home, having cancelled all meetings for the day, something practically unprecedented in her meticulously planned career. "Were you able to discover anything, Professor?" she asked as soon as she received him in the living room. "Yes. And it's more complex than I initially imagined," he replied, placing the briefcase on the coffee table. "The samples I collected yesterday confirmed my suspicions. You are dealing with a rare species of triatomine, a hematophagus insect from the Reduviidae family. In English, please. Popularly, it would be a variation of what we call the kissing bug or assassin bug. These are insects that feed on blood during the night. However, this variant is extremely unusual." Elizabeth sat down, trying to absorb the information. "I thought these insects were found only in rural areas, mainly in the south or southwest." "Normally, yes, but this is a subspecies that has very peculiar characteristics. To begin with, it's practically invisible to the naked eye due to its reduced size and coloration that camouflages perfectly with the environment. Additionally, It has developed resistance to common insecticides used in urban environments. The professor opened his briefcase and removed a small glass vial with some tiny spots that Elizabeth could barely distinguish. These are specimens that I collected from the fibers of your bed. Under the microscope, they reveal a surprising anatomical structure with adaptations that had never been documented before. And how did they end up here? I live on the 20th floor of a building in the middle of Park Avenue. The professor adjusted his glasses before answering. Your new pieces of furniture. I carefully analyzed that Indonesian wooden dresser next to your bed. Within the natural cracks of the wood, there are clear signs of a small colony. These insects probably came with the piece and found ideal conditions here to proliferate. That's repugnant, murmured Elizabeth, instinctively moving away from the mentioned dresser. But there must be some method to eliminate them, right? That's where the situation gets complicated. Conventional extermination methods would prove ineffective. We would need to develop a specific protocol, combining extreme heat techniques, specialized chemical treatments, and possibly even the removal and destruction of some furniture. The news hit like a bomb. That furniture had cost a fortune, representing not only a financial investment, but also the result of months of searching for exclusive pieces that reflected her professional success. I need to consult specialists in biological control from other institutions, continued the professor. We've never documented this variant in New York before. This could represent a public health problem if it's already spreading to other residences. Professor, I'd like us to keep this discreet for now, interrupted Elizabeth. I have a career to protect, and I don't want rumors about exotic infestations in my apartment circulating out there. Oliver hesitated. I understand your concern, but there is a worrying aspect. The company that imported these pieces of furniture for you probably brought similar pieces for other clients, if they're all infested. Let's solve one problem at a time, she cut in. First, eliminate these bugs from my apartment. Then we'll decide how to proceed with the rest. Reluctantly, the professor agreed to focus on Elizabeth's specific case before alerting health authorities. He instructed her to spend a few nights away while he organized a specialized team for the treatment. The next day, Elizabeth settled into a luxury suite at the Plaza Hotel, one of the most exclusive in the city. From there, she would continue to manage her professional schedule while her apartment received treatment. She informed Mrs. Zimmerman that she would be traveling for work and that a routine maintenance would be carried out in the apartment during her absence. By evening, she received a visit from Richard in her hotel room. So mutant bugs? Sounds like a B-horror movie plot, he commented, after Elizabeth explained the situation. Please, don't even joke about it. I'm trying to keep the situation under control. If the press discovers that the future bank president has an infestation of exotic insects at home, your secret is safe with me, assured Richard, but I'm worried about you. What if these bugs transmit diseases like common kissing bugs? The possibility had not gone unnoticed by Elizabeth. Professor Quinn had briefly mentioned that he was conducting tests to determine if the variant was a vector of pathogens, but he still had no conclusive results. I'll do complete exams tomorrow, she replied, but the professor thinks it's unlikely they transmit serious diseases. Apparently, they are very different from traditional kissing bugs. 3 days later, Elizabeth received the call she was expecting from Professor Quinn. We've completed the initial treatment in your apartment, Ms. Morgan. We combined an extreme heat protocol with fumigation using compounds developed specifically for this species. We believe we have eliminated the main colony, but I need to be frank. Some may have survived in egg or nymph stages that are more resistant. So I still can't return home? You can, but I recommend maintaining careful monitoring. We'll install special traps and conduct weekly inspections for the next few months. And unfortunately, we had to completely remove that Indonesian dresser. That was the main focus. Elizabeth sighed. I understand. Do whatever is necessary. Upon returning to the apartment the next day, Elizabeth immediately noticed the empty space where the beautiful hand-carved dark wood dresser once stood. The professor had replaced the furniture with discreet traps strategically positioned around the bedroom. That night, on her first sleep at home after the intervention, Elizabeth woke up startled around 2 in the morning. For a moment she thought she had felt that familiar tingling on her skin, but soon realized it was just a phantom sensation. Her body was so conditioned to discomfort that it now produced it psychologically. The next morning she carefully examined her body in the mirror and found no new marks. The old ones were in the process of healing. She felt relieved for the first time in weeks. The work routine resumed its normal course, without the constant interruptions caused by itching and discomfort. Elizabeth went back to shining in meetings and presentations. The prospect of her promotion to bank president became once again the main focus of her life. A week after the treatment, Professor Quinn returned to check the traps and make a new inspection. The result was encouraging. No specimen had been captured, suggesting that the treatment had been successful. "It seems we've managed to eliminate the infestation," he announced with relief. "But we have another matter to discuss, Ms. Morgan." Elizabeth noticed the gravity in his voice. "Any problem?" "I was able to perform more detailed tests on the specimens we collected here. There is something very peculiar about this variant. Its morphology suggests a forced adaptation, not a natural one." "What exactly does that mean?" "In simple terms, there are indications that this species may have been manipulated in a laboratory. The mutations are very specific and directed towards allowing its survival in urban environments." A shiver ran down Elizabeth's spine. "Are you suggesting that someone created these insects on purpose?" "It's a possibility I cannot rule out. We need to investigate the origin of these pieces of furniture more thoroughly." The importer was Edward Galloway Antiques and Imports. They specialize in exclusive pieces from Asia. The professor wrote down the name. "I'll discreetly check if other clients of theirs have reported similar problems. I'd also like to know, if you would have any objection, if I shared my findings with a colleague at the CDC. He's an expert in insect toxins and could help us better understand this species." Elizabeth hesitated. The more people who knew, the greater the risk of the story leaking to the press. On the other hand, if those insects were really the result of laboratory manipulation, the problem could be much bigger than she imagined. "All right, Professor. But please keep my name confidential." After the professor left, Elizabeth called Richard. "I need you to do a discreet investigation. Find out everything you can about Edward Galloway Imports and their suppliers in Indonesia and Thailand. There's something strange going on, and I need to know if I'm in the middle of something bigger than a simple infestation." "I'll take care of it. I'll contact some sources and see what I can find out," Richard replied, intrigued by the urgent tone in his friend's voice. That night, as she tried to sleep, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about the professor's words. The idea that those insects might have been artificially created opened a range of disturbing possibilities. Why would someone do this? And how did they end up in furniture imported to the United States? Looking at the shadows in her bedroom, now devoid of the beautiful Indonesian dresser, Elizabeth felt that this matter was far from over. Something told her that the mysterious bites were just the tip of a much deeper and darker iceberg. The chai. Next morning, Elizabeth woke up to the persistent sound of her cell phone. It was Richard calling earlier than would be acceptable on any other day. "Beth, sorry to wake you, but you need to see what I found about Edward Galloway." "It's 7 in the morning, Rick," she murmured, still sleepy. "What's so urgent that—" "It can't wait until we get to the office. It's not something I want to discuss at the bank. Can I stop by your apartment before work?" "In half an hour." The urgency in Richard's voice made her alert. "All right, I'll be waiting for you." While preparing for the day, Elizabeth checked her body in the mirror again. No new marks, a relief that had lasted 9 days now. The old bites were almost completely healed. Despite this, the feeling that something much bigger was happening did not leave her. Punctually, Richard arrived with a folder and a worried countenance. Without ceremony, he spread documents on Elizabeth's dining table. "What I discovered is concerning. Edward Galloway Imports is not just a luxury antiques company. They are a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate called GR Ventures, which has businesses in surprisingly diverse sectors: biochemistry, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and curiously, pest control." Elizabeth examined the documents. Business records, news articles, and charts showing connections between different companies. "And there's more," continued Richard. GR Ventures is controlled by Gregory Reynolds, A name that might not mean much to you, but he's a discreet magnate with strong political influence. His laboratories in Thailand were investigated 3 years ago for suspicions of unregulated research with pathogens and genetic modification of insects. Genetic modification of insects? Elizabeth felt a chill. Like the ones the professor found in my apartment. Exactly. The case was hushed up and the investigations archived after some influential politicians intervened. Officially, the Thai laboratories work with biological pest control for sustainable agriculture. Elizabeth ran her hand through her hair, trying to process the information. What interest would a biotechnology conglomerate have in selling antique furniture? That's the million-dollar question, replied Richard. But there's another interesting detail. Guess who is one of the main shareholders of our bank? Don't tell me. Gregory Reynolds, through offshore companies. He discreetly controls about 8% of the shares. That revelation hit Elizabeth like a punch. As financial director, she knew most of the bank's major shareholders, but some foreign holdings maintained a certain anonymity, protected by complex corporate structures. Rick, this is crazy. Are you suggesting that I was deliberately exposed to these insects? That someone at GR Ventures or Reynolds himself orchestrated this? I'm not suggesting anything so direct, he replied cautiously, but the coincidence is disturbing. You're about to become president of a bank where he has significant interests, and suddenly you're exposed to a genetically modified insect species that came in furniture supplied by a company he controls. Elizabeth stood up and walked around the room, trying to organize her thoughts. We need more information before drawing hasty conclusions. Professor Quinn mentioned that he would check if other Edward Galloway clients had similar problems. As if invoked by the mention of his name, Elizabeth's cell phone rang, showing the entomologist's number. Professor, I was just talking about you. Ms. Morgan, the scientist's voice sounded tense. We need to talk urgently. I've made some disturbing discoveries. Can we meet today? Of course. How about late afternoon, around 6? I prefer a more private location, the Botanical Garden, near the Central Lake. The suggestion of a public place instead of her apartment or the university laboratory seemed strange, but Elizabeth agreed. I'll be there. After hanging up, she looked at Richard with concern. The professor wants to meet me at the Botanical Garden. He seems nervous. Want me to go with you? No, better not, but stay alert. I'll call you as soon as I finish. At the bank, Elizabeth tried to maintain a normal routine, but her mind was buzzing with theories and possibilities. During a meeting with the compliance team, she could hardly concentrate when the name GR Ventures appeared on a list of companies to be analyzed for new credit lines. Any problem with GR Ventures? Beth? Asked Danielle Stevens, the compliance director, noticing her reaction. No, none. I just remembered that we need to check some exposures we have with their subsidiaries, improvised Elizabeth. At the end of the afternoon, she headed to the Botanical Garden, a green oasis in the middle of the grey city. As she walked towards the meeting point, she noticed an unusual movement of people in maintenance uniforms, more than would be normal at that hour. Professor Quinn was already waiting, sitting on a bench near the lake. He looked more haggard than last time, with deep dark circles and visible nervousness. Thank you for coming, Ms. Morgan, he said, constantly looking around. What happened, Professor? You seem apprehensive. With reason, he replied in a low voice. After analyzing the specimens more deeply and sharing my discoveries with my colleague at the CDC, we started to receive unwanted visits at the laboratory. People asking questions, supposed health inspectors wanting to know about our recent research. That could be a coincidence, suggested Elizabeth, though without much conviction. Perhaps. But last night my laboratory was broken into. Equipment destroyed, samples stolen, including all the specimens I collected from your apartment, and most alarmingly, all my notes and digital files about this species have disappeared. Elizabeth felt a knot in her stomach. My God, did you file a police report? Yes, but they treated it as a common theft of university equipment. What they don't know is that nothing of significant value was taken, only materials related to this specific research. The professor removed a small flash drive from his pocket. Fortunately, I keep a backup at home. Here is everything we've discovered so far. The species I found in your apartment is a genetically modified variant of Triatoma infestans with characteristics that could only have been created in a laboratory. They were designed to be practically undetectable, resistant to common insecticides. And there's one more thing. He hesitated as if pondering whether he should continue. What is it, Professor? These insects were not modified just to better survive in urban environments. They were altered to carry a specific pathogen. It's not Trypanosoma cruzi that causes Chagas disease, but something different. A kind of modified bacteria that seems to have very peculiar properties. What kind of properties? Asked Elizabeth, feeling a chill despite the warmth of the afternoon. We don't fully understand yet, but in preliminary tests we observed that it affects the central nervous system in subtle ways. It doesn't cause an acute disease, but produces gradual behavioral changes, increased stress, difficulty concentrating, mood alterations, and, in more advanced cases, greater suggestibility. Elizabeth looked at her own hands, remembering the bites. Are you saying that these bites could alter my behavior? Theoretically, yes, although the effect varies from person to person. Its initial manifestations could be confused with work, stress, or insomnia. The true objective seems to be to create a condition of psychological vulnerability without an easily diagnosable clinical picture. Professor, Elizabeth lowered her voice even more, I discovered today that the company that sold me this furniture has connections to the GR Ventures conglomerate, which in turn is controlled by Gregory Reynolds, one of the major shareholders of the bank where I work. The professor's eyes widened. So it's not a coincidence. Someone wanted to affect you specifically. But why? I'm about to become president of the bank. Why would someone try to destabilize me? Maybe that's exactly why. Maybe someone wants a president who can be influenced. The professor put the flash drive away again. Get complete medical exams as soon as possible. There are antibiotic treatments that can neutralize these bacteria before they cause permanent effects. At that moment, Elizabeth noticed two men in suits approaching along the main path. They seemed out of place among the casual visitors to the garden. Professor, I think we're being watched. Quinn looked discreetly and turned pale. They're the same men who were asking questions at the university. We need to leave now. They got up casually and took an alternative path among ornamental shrubs that offered some cover. Tomorrow I'll send the complete data to a colleague in Argentina, a specialist in hematophagus insects. He'll be able to continue the research outside the United States, away from these interested parties. And what about me? What should I do? First, those treatments we did in your apartment seem to have eliminated the infestation, but it's not guaranteed. I would recommend considering a temporary move. Second, someone clearly wanted you to be exposed to these parasites. The question is, who would gain from this? As they said goodbye near the park exit, Elizabeth noticed that the two men had strategically positioned themselves near the parking lot. They're waiting for us, she whispered. Let's separate. Leave through the east gate, less used. I'll create a distraction. Before Elizabeth could protest, the professor advanced towards the main exit, pretending to trip and dropping his briefcase with papers that flew everywhere. The men in suits hesitated, looking at the scene and then around, searching for Elizabeth. Taking advantage of the confusion, she escaped through the side gate and quickly called a taxi. As she entered the vehicle, her cell phone vibrated with a message from Richard. Got worried and came to the garden. I see you getting into the taxi. There are two suspicious men at the main exit. Be careful. I'll call you later. On the way home, Elizabeth felt her heart racing. What initially seemed like a simple insect infestation now revealed itself as a possible conspiracy involving genetic manipulation, corporate interests, and, perhaps, her own career. Elizabeth could barely sleep that night. Every noise in her apartment made her start, imagining invisible insects or intruders trying to break into her residence. At dawn, she made a decision. She could not continue in that growing state of paranoia. It was time to act. Her first call was to a trusted medical laboratory, where she scheduled complete exams for that same morning. The second was to Julia, her dermatologist, who was visibly alarmed by the updated report of the situation. "My God, Beth, this is much more serious than we initially imagined," said Julia. "You should consider contacting the authorities." "Which authorities exactly?" Elizabeth retorted bitterly. "If my suspicions are correct, we're talking about people with powerful connections. I need more evidence before taking any drastic step." While preparing to leave, the intercom rang. It was Mrs. Zimmerman announcing that a courier had left an urgent envelope. Elizabeth authorized him to come up. Minutes later, the housekeeper handed her an unmarked brown envelope. Carefully, Elizabeth opened the envelope. Inside was just a sheet of paper with a typed message. "Reconsider your nomination for the bank presidency. Your health may depend on it." A chill ran down her spine. The threat was explicit, though carefully formulated to not constitute concrete evidence. She showed the paper to Mrs. Zimmerman. "Who delivered this?" "A guy on a motorcycle, one of those express delivery services. He looked like a regular courier." Elizabeth carefully placed the paper in a folder. Now she was certain someone really didn't want to see her as bank president, and that someone was willing to use extremely unconventional methods to prevent it. At the medical laboratory, Elizabeth requested absolute discretion. "I need these results not to be entered into the normal system. Treat it as a confidential case, please." The doctor, who attended her, seemed intrigued, but agreed after Elizabeth mentioned she would pay an additional amount for discretion. Samples of blood, urine, and even epidermal tissue from the areas affected by the bites were collected. Besides the routine exams, I'd like you to check for the presence of atypical pathogens, particularly bacteria, that may affect the nervous system, requested Elizabeth. "That's quite specific," commented the doctor. "Are you suspecting a particular condition?" "Let's say I have reasons to believe I've been exposed to something unusual." Upon leaving the laboratory, Elizabeth received a call from Richard. "We need to talk in person. I discovered more things about GR Ventures and Gregory Reynolds, and it's not just about you. There have been other cases." "Other cases? Of bites?" "Not." "Over the phone. Can we meet at Bryant Park in an hour, near the Modern Art Museum?" "I'll be there." While driving to the park, Elizabeth reflected on her situation. In just a few weeks, her organized and predictable life had transformed into a conspiracy thriller. If the anonymous threat wasn't enough, Richard's mention of other cases confirmed her worst suspicions. She wasn't the only victim. Bryant Park was relatively quiet for a Wednesday morning. Elizabeth located Richard sitting on a bench near the lake, feeding ducks with pieces of bread. It seemed like a bucolic scene, but she immediately noticed the tension in his shoulders. "Any problem?" she asked as she approached. "I think I've been followed since yesterday," he replied without turning around. "Nothing obvious, but I noticed the same car passing several times near my house." Elizabeth sat down beside him, maintaining a casual posture while observing the surroundings. "What did you discover?" "I made contact with an investigative journalist who was looking into complaints against GR Ventures for some months. According to him, you're not the first high-ranking executive to be gifted with furniture from Edward Galloway containing our little biting friends." "Who else?" "At least 3 confirmed cases in the last 2 years. A Federal Reserve director who would vote on regulations that would affect Reynolds' businesses, a federal judge who would rule on a case involving one of GR's subsidiaries, and the CEO of a pharmaceutical company that directly competed with Reynolds on a new medication." Elizabeth felt her stomach sink. And what happened to them? The Fed director resigned, citing health problems, after making surprisingly favorable decisions to Reynolds' interests. The judge recused herself from the case after erratic behaviors in hearings, and the pharma CEO sold his stake in the company for well below market value, shortly before the launch of the medication they had developed for years. So it's a pattern. murmured Elizabeth. "They use these insects to infect key people with something that subtly alters their behavior, making them more manipulable." "Exactly. And the diabolical beauty of the plan is that no one would ever suspect. Who would associate questionable decisions with insect bites? At most, people would notice that the individual seemed stressed, tired, or slightly different. All symptoms easily attributable to the stress of the position." Elizabeth tried to process what that meant. "Rick, I received an anonymous threat this morning suggesting that I should give up the bank presidency." Richard's eyes widened. "That changes everything. It means they know you discovered about the insects. The normal approach would be to let you assume the presidency already affected by the bacteria, making you more susceptible to their influences. If they're asking you to step back, it's because they realized the original plan failed." "Thanks to Professor Quinn," observed Elizabeth. "If he hadn't identified the infestation so quickly." "And speaking of him, have you had any contact today?" Elizabeth shook her head. "He said he would send the data to a colleague in Argentina, but I haven't heard from him since we separated at the Botanical Garden yesterday." "I'll try to find out something through contacts at the university," offered Richard. "Meanwhile, we need to think about the next step. The board meeting that will formalize your promotion is in 3 days. They clearly want you to give up before that." "I won't give them that satisfaction," affirmed Elizabeth with determination. "But I also can't simply ignore the threat. If they use genetically modified insects once, who guarantees they won't try something more direct next time? We need concrete evidence that connects Reynolds to all this, something solid enough to present to the authorities, or at minimum to the bank's board." Elizabeth thought for a moment. The importer, Edward Galloway, must have records of all furniture brought from Asia, their recipients, and most importantly, their original suppliers. If we can prove that these specific pieces came from facilities linked to Reynolds' laboratories in Thailand. "It's risky," warned Richard. "The importer is probably under their surveillance, especially now that they know you discovered everything." "We don't need to go in person," replied Elizabeth. "I have a better idea." That afternoon, Elizabeth activated one of her most valuable contacts, Melissa Duarte, IRS fiscal auditor and old college classmate. Under the pretext of an internal compliance investigation at the bank, she requested detailed information about Edward Galloway's imports over the last 3 years. "This kind of request coming directly from a bank director is a bit unusual," commented Melissa on the phone. "Normally this would go through the legal department." "It's a sensitive case, Melissa. We're checking potential high-risk clients before approving some significant credit lines. You know how the new compliance rules are." The half-truth seemed to convince Melissa, who promised to send the data by the end of the day. Elizabeth knew she was treading on dangerous ground by using her position to obtain this information, but she felt she had no alternative. Meanwhile, Richard was doing his part investigating Professor Quinn. Around 3 in the afternoon, he called with worrying news. "Beth, the professor didn't show up at the university today. I called his house, but no one answers. His colleagues are worried because he never missed a class without notifying them before." A feeling of dread took hold of Elizabeth. "Do you think something happened to him? I don't want to be alarmist, but considering everything that's happening, I'll go by his house to check." "Don't go alone," warned Elizabeth. "If something happened to the professor, you could be putting yourself at risk." "I'll take a friend from the detective unit. He owes me some favors." At 6 in the evening, Elizabeth received the email from Melissa with the requested data. She analyzed it meticulously, looking for patterns or connections. The records clearly showed that Edward Galloway regularly imported pieces from a company called Siam Heritage Furniture, based in Bangkok, Thailand. A quick search revealed that Siam Heritage was a subsidiary of a conglomerate called Asian Biosolutions, which in turn had links to GR Ventures. The connection was established. The infested furniture came from a company that, through layers of subsidiaries, was controlled by the same Gregory Reynolds. More importantly, the import records showed other recipients of the same shipments. Among them, the names Richard had mentioned: the Federal Reserve Director, the federal judge, and the pharmaceutical CEO. Elizabeth documented everything carefully, making copies of the files on different storage devices. This was the evidence they needed to establish a clear pattern of suspicious activity. When she was finalizing her analysis, she received a message from Richard. "I'm at the professor's house. Door open, signs of struggle? No sign of him? Police on the way, be careful, they're acting more directly now." The disappearance of Professor Quinn elevated the situation to a new level of danger. Elizabeth, now with concrete evidence in hand but aware that her own safety was at risk, needed to carefully decide her next move. The following morning, 2 days before the decisive board meeting, Elizabeth received the preliminary results of her medical exams. As Professor Quinn had warned, traces of an atypical bacterium were detected in her blood. The medical report, although cautious, indicated that the pathogen presented unusual characteristics and could affect neurotransmitters related to decision-making behavior and emotional control. "We recommend immediate treatment with broad-spectrum antibiotics," concluded the report. "The long-term effects of this infection are still unknown." Elizabeth immediately started the prescribed treatment, but concern for her health gave way to an even greater one: how to expose the conspiracy without putting more lives at risk. The professor's disappearance demonstrated that those involved would not hesitate to take extreme measures to protect their scheme. Her phone rang. It was Richard. "We need to meet urgently," he said, his voice tense. "The situation has worsened. I'm being openly followed now, and I received a message similar to yours suggesting that I take a prolonged vacation for the good of my health." "My apartment is no longer safe," replied Elizabeth. "Let's meet at the Plaza Hotel in an hour. 3rd floor near the bookstore. It's public enough to give us some safety." On the way to the hotel, Elizabeth noticed a black car that seemed to be following her taxi. She asked the driver to make random detours, eventually managing to lose the possible pursuer. Upon arriving at the meeting place, she found Richard visibly nervous, constantly checking his surroundings. "I have news about the professor," he said as soon as they sat down in a discreet cafe. One of the building janitors saw when 2 men escorted him to a car during the early morning. The professor seemed disoriented, but didn't appear to have visible injuries. "So he's alive," sighed Elizabeth, feeling slight relief. "Probably. But we don't know where they're keeping him or in what conditions." Richard hesitated before continuing. "Beth, I found something in his apartment that the police didn't notice. A note hidden inside a book with a single phrase, 'Contact DC immediately.'" "DC? Washington?" "Exactly. I believe he has some contact in the federal capital who could help. Maybe someone from the FDA or the Department of Health." Elizabeth reflected for a moment. "The professor's call records could give us a clue." "I already thought about that. A friend at the phone company is discreetly checking. Should have news by the end of the day." While they were talking, Elizabeth observed suspicious movement near the cafe entrance. 2 men in suits entered, looked around and sat strategically at a table with a direct view of them. "Don't look now, but I think we have company," she whispered. "We need a plan to get out of here without alerting them." At that moment, Elizabeth's cell phone vibrated with an anonymous message. "Gregory Reynolds would like to speak personally. Alone. Today, 5 p.m., Atrium Building, Midtown, Penthouse." She showed the message to Richard, who turned pale. "It's a trap," he stated. "You can't go alone." "Maybe it's our only chance to get answers and ensure the professor's safety," countered Elizabeth. "Besides, we're cornered. If we don't go to them, they'll come to us, and they might not be so inviting next time." After intense debate, they developed a plan. Elizabeth would attend the meeting, but with precautions. First, she shared all the collected evidence with 3 different people, with instructions to disclose it if something happened to her. Second, Richard and his detective friend would position themselves near the building, ready to intervene. Finally, they activated an app that would transmit Elizabeth's cell phone location and audio live to Richard. At 5 in the afternoon, Elizabeth arrived at the imposing Atrium Building, a tower of glass and steel that housed offices of some of the most powerful companies in the country. At the reception, she was greeted by an impeccably dressed secretary who led her directly to the private elevator. "Mr. Reynolds is waiting for you," she said coldly. The penthouse revealed itself as a luxurious office with large windows that provided a panoramic view of the city. In the center, behind an imposing dark wood desk, was Gregory Reynolds, a man in his 60s, perfectly trimmed grey hair and penetrating eyes that didn't match his polite smile. "Ms. Morgan, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person," he said, standing up to greet her. "I've been following your career with great interest." "I imagine so," replied Elizabeth, maintaining her composure despite her nervousness. "Especially considering the present you sent me recently." Reynolds' smile didn't falter. "Straight to the point. I appreciate that in an executive." He gestured for her to sit down. "Yes, that beautiful Indonesian dresser was specially selected for you. A unique piece, as unique as your talent. And the microscopic inhabitants that came with it were also specially selected." Reynolds let out a soft laugh. "I see you've discovered our little collaborators. That was unexpected. Most people never realize the true nature of the problem. They just suffer the symptoms which they attribute to stress or fatigue. Like the Federal Reserve Director, the federal judge, and the pharmaceutical CEO," provoked Elizabeth, carefully observing his reaction. A flash of surprise crossed Reynolds's face before he regained his composure. "Impressive. Your investigation was deeper than we anticipated." He poured himself a glass of water. "You know, Elizabeth, may I call you that? In politics and business, direct influence is rarely the most effective. Threats are vulgar, and bribes leave trails. But a subtle neurological recalibration? That's art." The brazenness with which he admitted the scheme left Elizabeth momentarily speechless. "Don't see me as a villain," he continued. "I see myself as a facilitator. Our biological tools don't force decisions. They just make people more receptive to certain arguments, less resistant to certain suggestions. Free will remains, only the inhibitions are softened. And Professor Quinn, did your recalibration include kidnapping him?" Reynolds' countenance hardened. The professor became an inconvenience when he identified our tools. "We're just ensuring that he has time to reflect on the benefits of scientific discretion." "Where is he?" "In a safe location, receiving the best medical treatment. His health is not at risk as long as certain conditions are met." Elizabeth felt her blood boil but maintained a neutral expression. "And what would those conditions be?" "Quite simple, actually. First, you resign from your nomination for the bank presidency, citing personal reasons, perhaps an international opportunity that unexpectedly arose. Second, all materials related to your little investigation are handed over to us without copies. Third, the professor signs a confidentiality agreement and accepts a generous research grant at a foreign university, preferably distant." Reynolds leaned forward, the smile now replaced by a calculating expression. "In exchange, we guarantee that everyone lives their lives in peace. The professor resumes his academic career, you receive an excellent position in one of our European companies, and your friend Richard, well, he will also find suitable opportunities far from here." Elizabeth kept her gaze fixed on Reynolds. "And if I refuse?" "It would be regrettable. First, I must clarify that this conversation is not being recorded. We've installed quite effective signal jammers in this room. Second, the evidence you've collected, though impressive for an amateur investigation, would hardly withstand legal scrutiny, especially considering my legal team and connections." He made a significant pause. "Finally, unfortunate accidents happen daily in this chaotic city." The veiled threat hung in the air. Elizabeth knew she was at a decisive moment. She had evidence, but no guarantees that it would be sufficient. She had allies, but didn't know if they could protect her or themselves against such a powerful and ruthless adversary. "I need time to consider your proposal," she finally said. "Naturally. You have until tomorrow, noon." Reynolds stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "One last thing, Elizabeth. I admire your intelligence and determination. In other circumstances, we would have been excellent allies. Think about that too when making your decision." Upon leaving the building, Elizabeth felt strangely calm despite the situation. She met with Richard at a nearby cafe, who had heard the entire conversation through the app. "He practically confessed everything," said Richard, incredulous. "The bastard has so much confidence in his own impunity that he didn't even bother to deny it." "Typical of someone who thinks they're above the law," commented Elizabeth. "But that's also his weakness. He underestimates those he believes are inferior." That night, instead of giving in to despair, Elizabeth devised a bold plan. First, she contacted Danielle Stevens, the bank's compliance director, revealing part of the situation, specifically the suspicious connections between Gregory Reynolds, GR Ventures, and the foreign companies. "Danielle, I need you to analyze this data with urgency and absolute discretion," asked Elizabeth, sending carefully selected documents that didn't reveal the complete story, but raised serious questions about conflicts of interest. Next, using information obtained by Richard's friend, she identified Professor Quinn's mysterious contact in Washington, D.C., Dr. Laura Patterson, Director of Biovigilance at the FDA. After a tense phone conversation during which Elizabeth needed to convince her of her credibility, Dr. Patterson confirmed that the professor had shared preliminary information about a possible behavioral biological weapon weeks before. "We started to investigate discreetly, but we faced inexplicable political blockages," revealed the director. "If you have concrete evidence, that changes everything." Finally, through Richard's police contact, Elizabeth arranged a confidential meeting with a U.S. attorney specialized in crimes against public health. She presented the complete dossier, including import records, medical exams, and, crucially, the recording of the meeting with Reynolds. "But he said the room had signal jammers," pointed out Richard, confused. "And it did," smiled Elizabeth. "That's why I used this." She showed a small analog recording device similar to a button. "Old technology, immune to digital jammers, a gift from my father when I took over as financial director. For tense meetings," he said. The next morning, precisely at 11:45, 15 minutes before the deadline given by Reynolds, a battalion of federal agents, accompanied by FDA officials and the FBI, simultaneously raided the penthouse of the Atrium building, the Siam Heritage Laboratory, in Thailand, with cooperation from local authorities, and the offices of Edward Galloway Imports. The operation, codenamed Insecta, was coordinated with military precision. Elizabeth, accompanied by Richard and the federal prosecutor, waited in a car parked near the Atrium building. "Reynolds is being detained for questioning now," informed the liaison agent over the radio. "We found documents being destroyed and servers being formatted when we entered." "The professor?" asked Elizabeth anxiously. "Teams are checking all properties registered in Reynolds' name and his company's. Still no news." The wait seemed endless. Then, shortly after 2 in the afternoon, came the news. Professor Quinn had been found in a private clinic on the outskirts of New York, registered under a false name. He was sedated, but in stable condition. "They kept him medicated, apparently to prevent him from communicating his location," explained the agent. "But the doctors say there is no permanent damage." Tears of relief welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. "And the others? The Federal Reserve Director, the judge? We're contacting all individuals identified as recipients of the imported furniture," responded the prosecutor. "We'll offer medical treatment and psychological support. As for the decisions made by them, while possibly under the influence of this bacteria, this will open a fascinating legal precedent." In the days that followed, Operation Insecta dominated the news. Detailed records were found indicating that the scheme had been going on for 5 years and had affected more than 30 people in He. Strategic positions, regulators, judges, executives, and even a senator. The complete analysis of the Thai laboratories revealed extensive experiments with variations of hematophagus insects and neuromodulator pathogens. Recovered emails showed the evolution of the biological tools, as Reynolds called them, from the first crude attempts to highly sophisticated and almost undetectable versions. Gregory Reynolds remained silent during the interrogations, hiding behind an army of lawyers. However, the amount of evidence grew daily as international investigators joined the case. His fortune was frozen and his companies placed under intervention. A week after the operation, Elizabeth visited Professor Quinn in the hospital. He was still weak but lucid and visibly relieved to see her. "Thank you for not giving up," he said, squeezing her hand. "When they captured me, I feared everything was lost." "I should thank you," replied Elizabeth, "if you hadn't identified those insects so quickly." The professor smiled fragilely. "It was pure scientific curiosity initially. I never imagined where it would lead us." He hesitated. "By the way, did your exams show improvement with the antibiotic treatment?" "Yes, the bacteria levels are almost undetectable now. The doctors believe there will be no permanent effects. Complete recovery, both physical and psychological, would take time. But the greatest victory was already assured: the exposure of a scheme that corroded the very foundations of democratic institutions. 2 months later, on a sunny spring morning, the bank's board finally held the postponed meeting. Unanimously, Elizabeth Morgan was confirmed as the first female president of the institution. In her acceptance speech, brief but eloquent, she emphasized the importance of integrity in all spheres of life. "There are visible and invisible threats to our ability to make truly independent decisions," she said to an attentive audience. "Some come from outside, others from our own insecurities and ambitions. Our greatest responsibility is to maintain constant vigilance, not just over others but mainly over ourselves." Among those present, Richard, recently promoted to compliance director, applauded enthusiastically. Beside him, Danielle Stevens smiled proudly. In Elizabeth's new apartment, she would never be able to sleep peacefully in the old one. A small collection of plants occupied the space previously dedicated to the elegant Indonesian dresser. The experience had transformed her view of luxury and comfort. Nights of peaceful sleep were now her most precious asset. In a secure laboratory at Columbia University, a team led by Professor Quinn, now recovered, meticulously studied the mechanisms of action of the insects and bacteria seized. The knowledge generated would be vital to develop defenses against similar biological threats in the future. And in the early hours of dawn, while the city slept, Elizabeth sometimes woke up startled, imagining she felt that familiar itching. But soon realized it was just a memory, a ghost of a danger now neutralized. Then she would settle back and smile at the darkness, no longer threatening, just serene. The case of the control insects, as it became known in the media, led to a complete revision of importation protocols and health surveillance throughout the United States. The technique developed by Reynolds, though frightening, ironically contributed to significant advances in neuroscience and the treatment of brain disorders. Elizabeth Morgan became a symbol of resistance and integrity in the corporate world. Under her leadership, the bank implemented the most rigorous ethical standards in the market. Occasionally, she still visited Professor Quinn, whose research now received international funding. Together, they ensured that knowledge about the biological tools would be used only to benefit humanity, never to control it. As for Richard, his loyalty and courage earned him not only a promotion, but the lasting respect of everyone around him. In his new role as compliance director, he developed pioneering systems to identify suspicious patterns of influence and manipulation in the financial system. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the foliage of New York, few noticed the tiny insects that still populated the dark corners of the city. Common creatures, harmless, a natural part of the urban balance, so different from those designed in the shadows by ambitious minds. Vigilance, Elizabeth had learned, could never completely cease. But fear, that could be mastered, as long as faced with courage and determination.